Has anyone noticed that the prices of watches have increased quite a lot over the last year? Well, you're not the only one. I feel like an old man saying that back in my day you could get a Rolex Submariner for that sort of money, but it's the truth. Watch prices have just continually climbed and climbed and climbed, one foot after the other with no end in sight, ever upwards. And on the flip side, people aren't buying into watches as much as they did 2 to 3 years ago. So in a nutshell, we are getting more expensive watches at retail and less people buying them. And that then begs the question, where do we go from here? Where do watch brands go from here? In the next 10 to 20 years, are they going to completely price themselves out? What is going to happen? And can we use this time as enthusiasts to capitalize on this situation? I mean, that's the million-dollar question. Money ruins all things. I think that was something I said in a video a year ago, but really think about it. Because when you put a value on something, giving it monetary worth, the picture shifts. You're now thinking things like, this costs so much, I can't afford it, or why is it so cheap, what's wrong with it? Or in the case of watches, that's too prestigious for me, or I'm not worthy. See, when you put a certain amount of money into something, you do, or we do a lot of the time, expect an equal sort of return. And as these premiums of watches climb higher, so we expect the quality to reflect it. That is where we're currently sitting in this hobby. New-time buyers probably don't know this enough, but we know that these price hikes have been affecting us as enthusiasts. Higher the cost of the item with equal or less attention to the quality of the product. And a lot of us are here at this point where we simply cannot justify buying these watches at these inflated prices at retail. You don't have to be a genius to work out that this will, in the long run, affect the enthusiasm in this field. Now, what got me so engaged in this subject was the story from a few years ago and how it's pretty fascinating when we saw a massive rise and also quite a decline in other areas. The first side to the story is what happened in 2020 to 2022 and how that impacted the retail space. And the second side to the story is how these big brands seem so much more compelled to come across more luxurious, more prestigious, in an aim to outcompete one another. So if we look at it entirely, it's not only a competition between consumers for the product, but it's also a competition between the brands and what they can offer the consumer. So part one of the story, we all know what happened to the world a few years ago. With that event, so we also saw a huge influx of speculators hopping onto the train, largely buying up watches with the sole interest in their return, selling them on the grey market. It was a massive shift for enthusiasts, and we were frustrated because we were deprived of the watches that we wanted because someone else had a better spend history. I'm not saying this for everyone, but we knew that deep down a lot of the wrong people were getting these watches for the wrong reasons. They were getting involved and they were depriving those of us who had been chasing them for nearly half a decade. We saw virtually every popular model trading for double, triple, quadruple their retail price. And it was ludicrous, right? We were collectively shaking our heads at it. I think deep down we knew that what comes up must come down. There's always going to be equilibrium found somewhere. Now, of course, at this time, business was booming. Popular brands couldn't keep their sought-after models in stores. And naturally, they couldn't keep up with demand, and this created quite a great stir and a fear amongst these brands. And through all of this, rival manufacturers were trying to outcompete one another with similar colored dials. I'm talking Tiffany blue, that was a great trend. And then, of course, the 1970s derived designs, the Genta-inspired integrated sports model. Every brand under the sun was trying to get involved. I mean, they were everywhere. And that was a trend, but it's one that seems to have integrated, see what I did there, a little bit better. Now, seeing all of this repetition from rival brands was tiring, but it also did give us a good litmus test into what the consumers wanted. There was quite a linear direction that brands could follow, and brands were willing to or trying to meet these demands. But as we left 2022 and arrived in 2023, someone decided to turn off the tap, and many of these largely inflated secondary prices plummeted on the grey market. To an extent now that instead of paying 3 times the retail price for a watch, you may be paying 20 to 40% extra on top of the retail price. So the bubble did not burst, but it definitely deflated, if you catch my drift. So the other side of the story is that brands obviously noticed that their product was selling for a lot more on the secondary market, and they wanted to get in on the action. So naturally, they had discussions about how they could restructure their pricing scheme, and even going so far to establish certified pre-owned programs so they could try and have a finger on the pulse and maybe dictate the demand and interest in these pieces. So really, all of these brands wanted to see more money per sale of an item. And there was clearly an opportunity for that, especially when demand was so high that they could barely keep stock of their items. And all the while, in an effort to compete with one another, seeing that their neighbor is raising their price, they feel they could do the same. But then it's also the brands playing into this notion of luxury. And their products needed to be priced accordingly to fit in with that image. So all of a sudden, we have seen how a luxury watch from one of the big brands, it has to cost at least 5,000 of your currency, being pounds, euros, dollars, whatever it is. And it's almost like you cannot expect anything less today. And everybody seems to pump up their prices from 5, 10, even 15% every few quarters of a year. Now, timing that with massive worldwide inflation, further costs for manufacture, logistics, planned proposals of new factories being established in an effort to produce more product, allowing for supply to meet demand. This all happening at a time where the vested interest in watches not as high as it used to be a few years back. So of course the planning and scheduling happened at the time when demand was the highest. We're now at a stage of decline, and these brands have spent so much money, they need to see that result. The short answer is luxury watches and their brands, they have grown too big for their boots. And there is now a massive percentage of people who aren't interested in spending these sorts of prices. The reality is, I would say, 29 of 30 people are wearing Apple watches today. So what does that mean for the Swiss watch industry? What does that mean for luxury watches? As we see all of these flashy new releases every year with great new materials, new technologies involved, a quick trip down the listing to see its recommended retail price, and that, instantly turns us cold a lot of the time, right? So I'm going to look at Omega as an example here because it's one of my favorite brands, but we could say the same about IWC, about JLC, Rolex to an extent, who, as we know, increase their watch prices every year by between 5 to 7%, maybe even more. What made or makes Omega great? Quality watches that you can walk in and buy. That's a huge plus. Extremely good movements with great technology behind them. And they used to be, more affordable than a Rolex. Far more affordable. And as enthusiasts, we knew that we were getting a bargain. I mean, come on, they are terrific. But with the introduction of, let's say, the 3861 caliber, the standardized Speedmaster movement, it has given Omega the incentive to increase their retail prices, 15, 20%? And these are not limited editions, these are not rare handcrafted pieces, these are run-of-the-mill Speedmaster professionals. And I know that we can all remember a time when the Speedmaster was only a few grand for a top-grade 1863 caliber or a 1861. So I'm not going to say that this is a simple exercise that we can just trace from one source. This is very much a spider's web of problems, of situations that affect brands differently. Some of these brands are trying to compete with one another when it comes to their prices and the level of quality that they offer. Other brands are trying to match prices on the grey market. They're trying to get more return for each sale. Other brands are trying to meet that consumer demand by starting new factories and producing more watches. But then there are also brands out there that just don't seem to have a single clue about what they're doing and throwing proverbial darts at the dartboard, hoping that something sticks. The long and short of it is that a lot of us cannot justify retail prices today. And I guess it's a reflection on the brands that they need a reality check of some kind. If the industry is struggling competing against the likes of Apple and their smartwatches, how can they bring new time customers in? Instead of working out a more cost-efficient way for manufacture and creating your prices around your watches accordingly that would attract new people, doing the opposite at this stage, increasing your prices, surpassing the threshold where people are not interested in buying your product, and the result is you're not making sales, then something has got to give. And I don't think the buyer is going to be the one to capitulate. So what is the future if this keeps on going? Well, brands continue to increase their prices, especially the big names. Odds are they probably won't sell as much product. Of course, this will mean that it will negatively impact the next generation. This will negatively affect their outlook. They won't be spending that sort of money on a watch when they can get an Apple Watch for a tenth of that price. And I believe that the brands that will find success during this time, ones that do have their heads screwed on and price their watches accordingly, names like Furlan Marry, Nevada Grenchen, Vulcain, names of watches that are now under new ownership that have been revitalized, or entirely new brands that have come out of nowhere and produce pieces that have exceptional quality for what you're paying. I guess the only way we can address these price hikes is to, one, communicate with our wallets, be smarter in what we buy and why we buy it, but also, I think, to address it, to talk about it more, to get the word out. I, for one, buy virtually all of my watches secondhand, and the majority of them cost 30% or even less than retail. And we all know this, that it's far more rewarding finding a super quality watch for way less than the exorbitant retail prices that feels far more attractive. But that's all I have to say about it. I'd like to know from you what you think is going to happen in the future, what's happening at the moment, and everything in between. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. See you in the next one.